We're on item 14, and we're in open, and welcome the members back. And we've considered questions and public excluded legal questions, and we are now in open, and I'm now going to hand to the principal author of the report, our General Manager of Plans and Places, John Dogood, and John will speak to the report before us. John, in your hands.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mayor, Councillors and members of the Committee, Independent Māori Statutory Board online. So, Chair, you've mentioned me as the principal author of the report. Aaron Shields, one of our team leaders, did the first draft, and I did work on it as well, and so Aaron is behind me in case I need to call on Aaron. We also have a number of our subject matter experts online who can help answer questions as we work our way through. So I do have quite a few slides to get through. Some of these slides you saw in workshops over the last few months, and others are new, but we've tried to condense it as much as possible. So the other presenters are, we have Elizabeth Laird, one of our planners who's been focusing on the city centre. So Elizabeth will present to you online shortly. Then back to me, and then I'll be handing over to Noel Reardon to take you through the special character slides. So I don't have the here we go, gadget to flick the slides over. So really this presentation does sort of follow the same structure as the committee report to try and keep things as tight and linked up with the report as possible. So the purpose of the report is to for you to finalise policy directions, to assist us as staff to finalise the Intensification Planning Instrument, as it's referred to under the Resource Management Act, which must be notified by the 20th of August. So we really need policy directions from you now, otherwise we'll be in August and we'll still be lacking that direction. So you have given us direction as staff along the way. We've had multiple workshops, multiple meetings where preliminary directions have been given, but now that we've had feedback from many thousands of Aucklanders and key stakeholders in Mana Whenua, and you've had workshops on that feedback, and we've had input from local boards, we're now at the point of either seeking your confirmation of previous policy directions, as we refer to them, or amending those policy directions, or in light of the feedback and further technical work that's been undertaken, agreeing to new policy directions. So, as you know, this work goes back to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development from 2020, but at the end of last year, as you also recall, there were some very significant changes made to the Resource Management Act, and Council made submissions to Select Committee, and that's only just over 6 months since the Amendment Act was passed, and so there's been a lot of work by yourselves, local boards, Mana Whenua and staff to really get to this point, and it's been extremely fast-paced, and there's still a lot of work to be done prior to the 20th of August. So this Intensification Planning Instrument, in really simple terms, we're required to give effect, implement, words of that nature, policies 3 and 4 of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. And then in terms of the changes to the Resource Management Act, that's the second bullet there, we've got to incorporate the medium density residential standards, with which you'll be pretty familiar. That's the permit 3 dwellings on a typical site in an urban area, and permit up to 3 stories, and various other standards that go along with that. And we must notify all of that in this Intensification Planning Instrument by the 20th of August. So policy 3 is the sort of the walkable catchments around stations, the city centre and so on, and around other town centres, local centres. Policy 4 is the qualifying matter. So that's kind of how the NPSUD works. On the one hand, it says intensify in these areas regardless of existing capacity under the unitary plan. And on the other hand, it says, well, there may be some reasons under policy 4 to modify those intensification requirements under the policy 3. So that's the purpose of the report. So a little bit just more on this intensification planning instrument. Walkable catchments around the city centre are 10 metropolitan centres in the Auckland area, starting with Albany in the north and Papakura in the south, and 8 others in between. I won't list them again, but you're pretty familiar with the metropolitan centres. Then the rapid transport network stops, so that's primarily the heavy rail stations, but also the northern busway and parts of the eastern busway. And that's where, in a very directive way, government, through the national policy stated in 2020, that we must allow buildings of at least 6 stories in height. Now, in some of these places, the unitary plan does allow buildings of 6 stories in height already, but not to anything like the extent that the NPSUD requires. And in fact, in some places, Auckland already allows more than 6 stories in these walkable catchments, but again, only in a very limited, targeted way, and that was worked through in the unitary plan process several years ago. The next tier of policy 3, intensification, is around the town and local centres and the very small neighbourhood centres. So a neighbourhood centre could be something as small as a service station, a dairy. Typically, you might have 2 or 3 of those, and we zone those neighbourhood centre. And that language of neighbourhood centre has been picked up by the government from unitary plan, and I'm sure other plans as well. Local centres tend to be a main shopping street with maybe anywhere between 20 to 30, 40 shops on a sort of single main shopping street. And then the town centres would tend to have a shopping mall perhaps, as well as a main street, or a larger shopping mall like St Luke's would be a town centre. And in some cases, the town centre might just be a collection of retail streets, so the sort of larger centres. So that's the hierarchy in the unitary plan, and it's also the hierarchy in the NPSUD. NPSUD does not say we have to enable 6 stories around those town, local and neighbourhood centres, but it does say we've got to enable a level of intensification that's commensurate with the services that they offer and as community services and commercial services that they offer. But it does leave the council discretion to decide how far beyond the commercial area itself we allow more intensification and what degree of intensification. And you've given direction on that previously. Incorporating the 3-storey medium density residential standards, I've talked about that, and the qualifying matters, with which you'll be pretty familiar, and we'll get into that in quite a bit more detail today, because that's the area where council does have quite a bit of discretion as where are the certain features in Auckland that warrant a reduction in height or density that might otherwise be required under the government's policy 3. So recommendations in the report, it's structured into, we're just going to fairly briefly recap on city centre, and we've got a refinement of a previous direction that you've given on the city centre. We're going to talk about those walkable catchments around the city centre and so on. We're going to talk about the other intensification around the other centres, then get into qualifying matters, have quite a bit of time on special character because that is the one that's generated the most significant public discussion and debate, and also around the council table here. We're going to talk about the issue of the light rail corridor and how that we're recommending that's addressed in your decision making today and again in August when the plan change is brought to you for notification. And we'll just touch on other matters such as having to vary council and private plan changes. That's a requirement that we have. So without further ado, hopefully we have very competent planners, Elizabeth Laird, online. I can see, Elizabeth, you're there. So welcome, Elizabeth. I can flick through the slides if you just give me a nod. Here we go. So,
Kia ora, John. Thank you.
And handing over to you now.
Thank you. So, kia ora koutou. I'm here today to give you an update to our approach to height in the city centre since we last spoke to you in March. And with me online, Sharon from our urban design team and Fiona Sprott, our planning team lead, who's been overseeing this part of the work. So just to remind you've probably seen this a lot today, that the NPSUD asks us in the city centre to enable building heights and density of urban form to realise as much development capacity as possible to maximise benefits of intensification. Next slide, please, John. And we've been given advice, guidance by MFE, and this, according to their guidance, this means removing barriers which are unnecessary and unreasonable and which prevent the maximum development capacity. The Ministry have said that within the hierarchy of centres in Auckland, the city centre sits at the top, and so it should have heights and densities that are relatively higher than our local centres and our metro centres. And our metro centres, just for reference, have heights up to 72.5 metres. So our city centre should enable more development capacity than that. Next slide. So they also suggest that this might look like having no maximum building height or no maximum floor area standards, but noted that it is okay to have development standards which limit height or density where these are contributing to a well-functioning urban environment. Next slide. So based on all this guidance and on the existing city centre rules and built form outcomes, we brought this set of principles to the Planning Committee in March this year, which were then approved. And you also approved in principle the removal of general height and of the floor area controls. Next slide. So we were initially thinking of getting rid of the general height control entirely, but keeping these special height controls. Now this could allow unlimited height in the city centre zone as a starting point, but still protect the specific outcomes that these special height controls look after. So these include sunlight admission to open spaces, volcanic view shafts and the museum view shaft, and protections of Aotea Square and the harbour edge. We undertook modelling to understand what potential heights we might get by removing general height controls, and I'm going to run through a few diagrams to illustrate. Next slide, please, John. So this is the existing city centre showing buildings that are currently on the ground. And on the next slide, we see the current general height controls. So you see at the moment, our general height controls work by granting height in the Queen Street core and suppressing height elsewhere. Next slide. And this is an indication of the special height controls. So this is the additional layer which protects those matters I mentioned before. And this is what the city centre might look like if we removed all the general height controls and precinct height controls and kept only the special height controls. You can clearly see the volcanic view shaft coming through and the museum view shaft and the sunlight controls around the parks in Aotea Square. Next slide, please. Sorry. And then what we looked at was this model, which shows the general height control removed and the special height controls in place, but also shows the heights determined by the precincts. And it's quite a different shape from the previous slides. In particular, it maintains the relationship to the harbour, which the waterfront precincts provide for. However, we're still seeing significant outliers of height. So along Stanley Street, the Ponsonby Road end of Karangahape Road, and a triangle coming up between the view shafts near Victoria Park. So we took this to our wider team and also to the Urban Design Review panel, and we got strong feedback that this was not a good outcome for the city centre. So there's concern about the legibility of the city centre as one cohesive centre, about the possibility of seeing a wall of towers along the eastern side, and of the effects on surrounding neighbourhoods. So we went back to the drawing board and reconsidered our approach to get a better balance between increasing height and development capacity and maintaining good outcomes for the city centre and ensuring a well-functioning urban environment. Next slide, please. So we're coming to you today with this updated approach. So we are still proposing to remove the constraints on floor area, which will enable additional development capacity. But for general height, instead of being unlimited, we're proposing to increase it to at least as high as the metro centre heights, 72.5 metres, except in a few specific areas where lower heights are protecting specific outcomes. We're also still proposing to retain the special height controls and built form controls as set out in the principles approved in March. Next slide, please. So this slide shows our current general height controls. They range from 15 metres up to 50 metres, and then the green area in the middle is the special height area where tall towers are already enabled and where heights are managed just by our special height controls. Next slide. And these are our proposed general height controls. So we propose to increase the height to 72.5 metres across the city centre, except in a few areas where lower heights are providing for qualifying matters. We will still have the special height area in the centre, enabling those tall towers. And spaces on the map that don't have colour on them are managed, that are still in the city centre, where height is managed by the precincts. Next slide, please. So this is a 3D model which shows the heights as set out on the proposed map. The dark green in the middle are our towers in the special height area, and the yellow is the 72.5 proposed general height limit. The orange and red areas are areas with precinct height limits. We will still have the special height controls applying, so there will be some lower heights applying on some sites. So some sites will have some additional height restrictions to protect certain outcomes, but this is the overall form that we can expect. Originally, as mentioned earlier, we looked at unlimited heights in that yellow area, but given what I've shown you in the slides in terms of built form outcomes, it's our opinion that this is a more appropriate built form outcome. So this will still provide a significant additional capacity. The test sites we've looked at have ranged from 6% up to 77% increase in development capacity, mostly in the 60 to 75% increase range. And although the approach to height has changed, we'll still have a focus on human scale podiums with tall slender towers above as set out in the principles. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Chair.
John, I'll go back to you. I'm not sure whether we take the questions now. How far would you like to break this up, or would you like to continue to the end of the presentation?
Chair, I've got a feeling for this one we break it up because it is quite unique, the city centre, and you know, requirements are quite different to the walkable catchments and qualifying matters and so on. So yeah, I think it'd be good to take questions, and this is recommendation A in the agenda report. You know, and as Elizabeth has said, it's really what you previously agreed to in terms of the city centre, still protecting that sunlight access into the open spaces and so on, but perhaps being a little bit more cautious in terms of some of those areas outside of that core high-rise area, which would continue to allow significant high-rise towers. So yeah, any questions on that would be great in terms of recommendation A.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Elizabeth, for taking us through that. So we're just restricting ourselves now to the information that helps inform our decision on recommendation A, and there are no changes from the staff recommendation on A that have been moved. Question from Councillor Simpson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, thank you for that presentation. Look, I am a bit concerned about the shading that will occur on our Auckland domain area. I noticed in the presentation that there was quite a lot of shading from the tall building on the domain. Have we done any work around what the impacts of that will be on the domain as far as shading goes?
Elizabeth?
Through the chair, yes, we have. So we have done shading assessments on open spaces in the city centre and also outside the city centre, including the domain. That is in line with the approach that was approved in March, which is why we haven't come back to you with a change about that. But we are proposing to protect those open spaces, including some additional sunlight protection for areas of open space which may be affected by greater height.
Thank you. I suppose, can I ask a different question a different way? Are you confident that the domain will not be a shady area? It will have access to good sunlight, even with these, with the agreement of the A principles?
Through the chair, that is the intention of what we're proposing. We'll have to see how that goes through the hearings process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Councillor Dalton, your question, please.
Thank you, Chair, through you. Just wanted to confirm, so it's applying a maximum 72.5, and might there be qualifying matters or other protections that will limit the heights around areas similar to what Councillor Simpson is talking about.
Elizabeth?
Yes, through the chair. Yes, the existing protections to open spaces in the city centre are proposed to be retained as a qualifying matter, and some additional protections to open spaces, as I said, which may be affected by this additional height, which don't currently have those protections. So those will apply separate to the general height control, and on each site, the lowest of those height limits will be the one that applies.
Just to follow up, so the diagram that you're showing us is indicative of the maximum for each.
Yes.
Yeah.
Through the chair. Yes,
Thank you.
correct.
Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I might have missed it. What was the overall capacity increase for the city centre with this change? Have we quantified that?
Through the chair, we don't have an overall number yet, but the test sites, most of the test sites we've looked at with the proposed 72.5 metre height limit and the proposed built form controls, which do limit capacity, but things like building setbacks. Most of the sites we've looked at are between a 60 to 75% increase, but it is very site specific, and we are looking at getting a figure for the whole of the city centre, but we don't have that available yet. We would need to do that through our GIS team.
And in the centre, the Queen Street Valley and that sort of green area, I think it was green, is there any unlimited height at all, or is that something that developers could still get resource consent for?
Through the chair. So in the central, in the special height area, which is that core area, we're proposing no general height control, which is as it is currently. We are proposing to retain the special height controls, which protect the sunlight to open spaces, and which form that shape that was shown on the 3D image. However, we are proposing to remove the constraints on floor area. So currently there's a maximum 13:1 floor area ratio to site area constraint, and we're proposing to remove that, which would enable towers potentially to go all the way up to that special height area, that special height limit, rather than being constrained below that by the intensity controls.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And now Councillor Walker.
Just in respect of, through you, Mr. Chair, just in respect of the heights, has there been any consideration around shading and wind as it goes to streets, bearing in mind that Auckland streets are comparatively narrow compared to overseas cities? Is that anything that we take into account?
Elizabeth?
Through the chair. Thank you for that question, Councillor. Yes, we are proposing to retain our wind controls, which mean that when a building is consented, the design will have to be assessed on the wind effects to the streets. We're also proposing a built form approach, which was approved by this committee in March, which is one of podiums and towers, which also helps with mitigating those wind effects. And so, yes, we are considering those amenity effects on the street as part of the overall set of controls that are being proposed.
The other question I've got just goes further to a question that was asked earlier about the increase in housing. I appreciate we haven't got that yet, which is disappointing. Is there even some guesstimate of what it amounts to? Because quite clearly it is informing our decision-making around the larger picture. But do we have a vague idea?
Elizabeth, you did refer to that before. Do you want to repeat?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Cover it
Chair.
again?
Yes, so Through the chair, unfortunately, as I said, I don't have the figures for the whole of the city centre available yet, but we are proposing height increases across the city centre apart from in a few specific areas, so we can expect a fairly significant increase in capacity. We also know that we already have development capacity enabled to meet short, medium and long-term demand in the city centre, so this would be providing development capacity above and beyond what our projected demand is in the city centre.
Supplementary question. My understanding is that the current situation under the Unity Plan allows another 100,000 within the city centre, roughly, as it is now. Might that double, or are we looking at the 70% that you mentioned?
Elizabeth, again.
Through the chair. So because the city centre allows residential and commercial activities, in terms of housing, it will depend on market demand, what we see developed there. But in terms of built form capacity, we will get those figures to you as soon as we have them. I imagine, though, that will probably come in the 4th of August Planning Committee report, as our team is still working on modelling the effects of all the proposed controls.
Thanks. Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Elizabeth. Councillor Coombe.
Thanks, Chair. Kia ora, Elizabeth. Just a hopefully very quick one. Around the note in paragraph 72 about the recommendation on the light rail corridor, what impact does that have on the city centre, and what the advice is in the decision today?
Through the chair, I might hand that over to John or Fiona to answer, just because that decision's obviously part of a much bigger piece of work.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth and Councillor Coombe. Megan, it's with you, isn't it? This light rail.
Kia ora, thanks. Through the chair, the intention, we've never worked through this or done this work so far with a view to constricting or restraining the city centre work. And so I think what we might do in terms of spatial is probably remove the, that overlay showing the light rail corridor across the city centre, because it was never our intention to use that to constrain development there. So that matter will come later for you to consider. If you feel we need to be a bit more specific, that's fine. Otherwise, that's what we're intending to do. It won't constrain development in the city centre.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Councillor. Back to Councillor Simpson.
Oh, thank you for your indulgence taking a second question. Elizabeth, can you give me confidence that the like of Albert Park will not be in shade as a result of the added height around the city centre?
Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I think you're on mute.
Apologies, Mr.
That's
Chair.
all good.
Through the chair, thanks for that question, Councillor. So Albert Park currently has sunlight emission protection controls, and we are proposing to retain those as a qualifying matter. We are also doing shading studies with the proposed heights of all the open spaces, and so that will be provided as part of our section 32, so you can see what the impact is, but it shouldn't, the current protections will be retained, and they're quite extensive for Albert Park.
Thank you.
And follow up from me on that, the same applies to Altea Square. Am I correct, Elizabeth?
Yes, Mr. Chair, both the sunlight emission protection and the Altea Square height protection plane are both proposed to be retained as qualifying matters.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. All the questions are out there. And thank you, Elizabeth.
Councillor Fletcher has a question.
Oh, I have Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Fletcher with a question.
No, I think that it's actually been
Okay.
dealt with. I was just wanting to know that officers have sufficient direction to feel that they can undertake the full scope of works to come back to us on assessment of parks in addition to the domain.
Okay, just a bit out of scope of this particular part, but look, thank you. Right, we've asked all the questions on that particular section. Back to you, John. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for your work. Back with you, John.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So moving on to the next topic, and this is recommendation B in the agenda report, so the walkable catchments. And this was a key topic during the consultation on the Council's preliminary response. So we got a lot of feedback on the walkable catchments, and you've had that in a workshop, and the results are published online. So in interest of time, and I don't have the results handy, but having reviewed that feedback, our subject matter experts on walkable catchments still of the view that we should have a bit of a hierarchy here, that we should go for roughly 800 metres around the metro centres and the rapid transit stops. That is consistent with the Ministry for the Environment guidance. As you've heard before, the guidance is guidance. It's not statutory. It's not required that Council complies with guidance. But the Ministry for the Environment guidance is saying a minimum of 800 metres. And there's a note in that guidance that there'll be an expectation that, there'll be a variation depending on the type of centre that is having a walkable catchment applied to it. So 1,200 metres equates to roughly a 15-minute walk. And there is evidence of studies to support that, a large proportion of people would be prepared to walk 15 minutes to access the wide range of amenities, public transport, civic functions, jobs in the Auckland city centre or equivalent centres overseas. And then the sort of 10-minute walkable catchment, that's the 800 metres as a bit of a guide, is often used in other cities, in studies and so on, as a sort of guide as to the distance someone would walk to rapid transit. And so we've aligned the rapid transit with the metropolitan centres, but we do believe that there is a distinction between the rapid transit stations, a bus station, and how far and the number of people who'd be willing to walk to the city centre. So we do believe another 5-minute differential, taking the 10-minute 800 metres up to 15-minute walk from the city centre as a guide. I think as you know, and as the public would have seen, these aren't concentric circles around the stations or circles around the stations and the centres. They do take into account topography, cul-de-sacs, severance by motorways and so on, a range of factors. And we're still doing, as we note in the report, some ongoing work, some ongoing refinement based on feedback. We're not able to analyse every single piece of feedback from every individual about every little change. We're doing our best to get across that, to bring some maps, an update of the maps to you on the 6th of July in a workshop, and then formally to you on the 4th of August as part of the intensification planning instrument. So we're essentially seeking that you confirm your previous position on the walkable catchments. There's a clarification there, I think, in the original Planning Committee resolutions. You were given some wording that didn't talk about the edge of the city centre zone. So when we say the walkable catchment from the city centre, we mean from the edge of the city centre zone as it exists in the unitary plan. And that's what the NPSUD requires anyway. So that is in the recommendations, recommendation B1, as per the Chair's recommendations. So that's clarification there. And just also noting B2, that there is ongoing review of the feedback. There is a Chair's recommendation that goes a bit beyond the presentation here, but I'll leave that now for to come back to later. So if we move on to the next the next requirement under the NPSUD Policy 3, it's not walkable catchments, but it's sort of akin to walkable catchments, and that is that we have to allow heights and densities around our town, local and centres that reflect the varying range of community and commercial services that they offer. Just note we do have, I think, Ryan Bradley, who's our principal planner, who's presented to you previously, senior planner who's done a lot of work on this topic and the previous one. So we're once again seeking that you confirm the approach that was in the preliminary response maps that went out for consultation of a terrace and apartment building zone, which allows for 5 stories adjacent to some of the town centres, the larger ones, the ones with good public, the better public transport, and some of the local centres would have that 5-storey zoning applied around them. It's the larger ones, again, with the better public transport in terms of that local centre category. So wide range of feedback, but more in support of this approach than perhaps going less or more in terms of the distance from these various centres. There is a recommendation in the report, it's C, and we listed some specific local centres in Auckland, and on further analysis since the report was prepared, what we were trying to avoid there was a situation where, in applying the first bullet point, your previous principles around the terrace and apartment zone, having 5-storey residential zoning with a local centre that only allowed 4 stories. Well, on further analysis, the height controls are pretty much the same, so we don't believe that it's now necessary to lift up these local centres to 6 stories so that you get that differentiation between a local centre and its surrounding residential. So just foreshadowing that C, we are recommending to now, we're not putting that forward as a recommendation despite it being in the report. But in terms of the smaller neighbourhood centres, we get this slightly unusual situation where if you apply the 5-storey terrace and apartment zoning around some of the town and local centres, you actually, the 200 or 400 metres, you actually go beyond a little shop, a group of shops, a dairy, a hairdresser, whatever it might be. It'd be a bit odd to keep the current 3-storey height control on that land when it's surrounded by 5-storey residential. So it's a bit of an anomaly that we've picked up since your previous, I guess, policy position on this topic here. So we are recommending that where that situation occurs, and we think there's probably about a dozen little neighbourhood shops across the whole region where this occurs, we're recommending that the height limit for that particular set of neighbourhood centre shops is increased to be equivalent to the surrounding residential. So hopefully that's not too technical. Maps are pretty helpful in these sort of situations, but hopefully that explains our recommendations under C in the agenda report. So we're just going to move straight on to, well, I'm just wondering, Chair, that might be worth...
I think we might pause
really
there.
get into qualifying matters.
Yeah, I think we might just pause on, we're dealing with the B.
B, walkable catchments.
B, walkable catchments.
Yep.
Let's just pause there. So question on the measurement from the edge of the city centre. I've looked at a lot of the guidance and how, the best practice, and the best practice is to identify where the agglomeration of amenity is and measure from there, and we're being required to measure from the edge, not from where the collection of amenity is. Jobs, it's a transport station like an Aotea station or Britomart station, I forget the new name. It's the cultural infrastructure, it's the community infrastructure, it's the park amenity possibly of Albert Park and Victoria Park. But we're not choosing that route, we're choosing, or it's prescribed to us that we measure from the edge.
It's prescribed in the MPSUD that it must be from the edge of the city centre zone. So it uses planning terminology of zone, and so it's from the edge of the city centre zone, which is a map-defined area, and at the edge of the city centre zone on the western side of the Auckland city centre is Victoria Park and Victoria Park Market, and then on the eastern side it would be the Key Park area and the port, and on the southern side it's Karangahape Road area. So it's essentially within the motorway horseshoe around the city centre, and it's from the edge of the zone there. So, and I guess, some of the literature, some of the studies would say that from the city centre, the walkable catchment should be 1,500 metres or perhaps even 1,600, 2 kilometres. And that's why, I guess that's one of the reasons we're recommending the slightly more conservative 1,200, recognising that on the edge of Auckland city centre, it doesn't offer the same wide range of services and so on that some other city centres around the world might do. So, but it's very clear that we don't have that option. It is from the edge,
okay,
rather than from some other point.
Go to others. Councillor Simpson, please.
Thanks, Chair, and through you. Look, I have a question around the 1,200 metres from the edge of the city centre zone. And if we have a growing elderly population, I mean, I can understand it if you're, you know, young, fit, healthy like me or you, but I'm talking about maybe an older population. What evidence do we have that they are able to walk that distance to the amenities that we're talking about? Because a lot of people have asked me to reduce that, and I just want to know what evidence I can supply back to say that you know, the decision is being made on evidence for our elderly people, or those potentially challenged.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Simpson. Through the chair. So the whole concept of walkable catchments is based on phrases like the average or the typical person. So it's not, walkable catchments aren't based on the distance that everybody who's able to walk, would walk. They're based on sort of an averaging. And so when research and surveys are undertaking, they're looking for not the distance that absolutely everyone would walk on a regular basis. They use different metrics and different methodologies, but it's generally based on how far an average, typical person, however you might define that, might walk. But it's not looking at the more the edges of where walking becomes more challenging for people for various reasons. So hopefully that helps explain it. So it is walkable catchments aren't based on making sure that all elderly people, for example, as one cohort, would walk that distance. It's just not what a walkable catchment is. But we do, I believe in previous reports to the Planning Committee, or certainly at a workshop, we've listed a sort of bibliography of all the bits of research and studies that have informed the landing at this position here, which is more shorter distances than some of the studies and literature might suggest, but perhaps further than some others. So it is, these distances are pretty much pitched in the middle point of all the literature in terms of distance. Yep.
Okay, and my second question is, and I don't know, Chair, whether I address this to you as a Chair's rec or around this, is you're saying around isn't actually 1,200 metres. It could be a little less in some places and potentially a little more in others. Is that correct?
That's for me. Yes, in the B3 that we've worked up, the Mayor and I have worked up. In fact, there's just a small change. I've just picked it up. It should have the word of around 1,200 rather than of 1,200. But that was in our policy directions from some months ago. So the word around stays. And there's further work to do on it.
So thank you. That's good to hear. Supplementary then. So when will that work be done, and when will the final decision be made around what the edge to the city centre zone is? John.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Simpson. So as I've mentioned before, you have one more workshop in your diaries on the NPS Urban Development. That's the 6th of July. I think it's a 4-hour workshop. So the intention for that workshop is to show you where the maps are getting to based on the decisions that you'll be making today. So we're starting to build in some of these already, but we'll revise them if certain amendments are made or things don't go through as per the report. But we believe we are on track to, on the 6th of July, give you an update from, you take the preliminary response maps that went out to Aucklanders, and then we look at what these amendments here and some further technical work might look like, and we will show you the differences on the 6th of July, get your feedback, and then bring the final maps to you on the 4th of August for endorsement. And unfortunately, that is the time frame that we're required to work to. We've all been working extremely hard, yourselves included, just to get to this point. And so we're really, we're on that last sort of 4 or 5 week countdown with one workshop left to show you the maps.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Good. Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. Got a question on the 1,200 metres. With particular reference to St Mary's Bay, was our committee ever informed around the guidelines from the Ministry for the Environment? I can't recall them. Have they appeared in any agenda item or the like to councillors or the community?
John. Yeah, through Chair, Councillor Walker. I can't recall specifically, but as I mentioned, at the workshop that you had on walkable catchments, which was last year, there was certainly a long list of research, but whether the guidelines were published at that time, if you could give me the date on them, it may be that you didn't have the benefit of that guidance and nor did we at the time that you gave a preliminary position on walkable catchments.
Correct.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I asked questions about those guidelines, and we did actually discuss the MPS guidelines. They were published actually before the legislative change.
September 2020.
Sorry?
September 2020 is the date.
Yep, they've been around for a long time.
So I'm pretty confident they would have been discussed at a workshop with you on walkable catchments.
Okay, so further to that, given that there are a range of factors, street layout, topography, that's hills and stuff, steps, urban amenities, street lighting, security, safety, mobility needs, and obviously there are many people that are mobility impaired. Have we done anything specific around any study that goes to, let's say, the St Mary's Bay catchment that would tell us whether or not 1,200 metres is realistic?
Through Chair, we haven't done a specific study on St Mary's Bay and haven't been able to in the time frame, but we've certainly looked at the feedback from St Mary's Bay individual property owners and resident groups and so on. So the team have looked at that feedback very carefully because it was in very high volume. Other parts of the region, lower volume, it's been harder to sort of pick out the feedback about walkable catchments, but certainly in terms of city centre, we're well aware of the feedback from St Mary's Bay residents. We looking to take on board, some of what we've read and some of the feedback and bring maps to you on the 6th of July at a workshop and then back to committee. So absolutely well aware of the issues raised by St Mary's Bay residents about the fact that I think most of St Mary's Bay was within the walkable catchment.
Sure, so just...
We're well aware of that issue. Yep.
So just further to that, and I understand it, essentially what you're saying is that there's further work to be undertaken, and that is indicated in one of the amendments that is under consideration for us to vote on. But at the same time, we're seeking to confirm the walkable catchments. So how can we confirm something, and the references to the earlier report that covers the 1,200 metres, for example, if at the same time we're looking to actually vary it because it may not work? And we have a significant body of evidence from professionals in the form of submissions to indicate that, where they have done the work, or they would appear to have.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's probably a legal public law type question. We're getting into, drafting of resolutions and there is a qualification there. You're confirming it with a subject to. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and Queen is more resource management law than public law, but look, the intent there is that there is still some ongoing work happening, particularly around the, well, not just the city centre, and, come August, you will be presented with the intensification planning instrument, and if at that point you feel that this resolution wasn't right, I guess that can be rescinded and cured. I mean, that might be the way of dealing with the legal technicality of the wording of B, but it's certainly, my plain reading of it is there's still a caveat on what you're confirming.
Thanks, John. I'll just go to the Chief of Strategy, please.
Kia ora, thank you. Through the chair, just wanted to make it really clear. It does say subject to, so what, and of course we're not just talking about the city centre zone, so I think it's really clear that we are saying that you confirm your previous decisions. However, there is a qualifier that you've asked us to do more work on the suitability of a 1,200 metre walkable area for the city centre. So we will come back, and in August, if you are dissatisfied with that evidence or that information, then you could change that view. So I think it's quite clear, and I'm quite satisfied with the way it's worded.
And just further to that, Mr. Chair, the same thing in terms of subject to is inherent here around 800 metre distances, for example, where they simply don't cut it in some circumstances, which is, I'm assuming...
You're saying, does the further review apply to all of that?
That's my reading is that is the case. I just want to confirm that.
John, it's best that you confirm that, John, that's the case.
I think in terms, because it's not, the other town centres aren't specifically pulled out in the way that the Chair's recommendation B, Roman numeral 3 is, it's probably more in the nature of refining the edges of some of those areas rather than fundamentally looking at whether the 800 metres is appropriate or not. So I think you know, Roman numeral 3 is pulling out the city centre 1200 in a slightly different way to the other town centres, because we're not seeing in the feedback any reason to perhaps depart from that. But I guess with the city centre, you know, there is St Mary's Bay and others suggesting that the 1200 is fundamentally flawed. So we're comfortable with a further investigation of that and bringing that back to you. But for the others, I would say, no, they're different. It's refinement as opposed to, is the 800 really the right distance, or the 400?
But there's further work being undertaken within the 800s.
Correct, to sort of pull in some edges and push out in some areas, looking at the feedback, including feedback from local boards.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor, please.
Thanks. Very basic question, John. With the town and local centres, 400, 200 metres walkable catchments thereabouts, with some further work to go in the heights of 16 metres. So will some of the zonings have to change to mixed business to allow some res above or from the pure business zones to actually have it practical?
Yeah, thanks, Deputy Mayor. Through the Chair, we would love to have looked at this whole exercise in a bit more detail, and certainly when you get into the next plan review, we'll be looking at, well, where should a residential terrace and apartment zone actually be a mixed-use zone where it can go office or residential or, you know, or a mix of both. But no, we haven't done the work to rezone land from terrace and apartment to mixed use. We have had a bit of feedback on that. It's just one of those things that was not the top priority. But the terrace and apartment zone is a little bit more enabling, permissive in terms of some non-residential uses than some of the other residential zones. So there's already a little bit of a leg up for non-residential in the terrace and apartment zone. So the plan already heads in that direction. But it's a good point. In some places, it may be better to just allow things to go office, residential, retail, without any sort of red tape in the way. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll now go to Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. And just on the walkable catchments, I have two questions.
You're
The
very
first one is
faint,
on-
Councillor Hills.
I've done it again with my earphone. I'm so sorry. I have two questions on the walkable catchments. The first one is on considering the policy does say that the city centre is supposed to be higher than the minimum and should be considered higher. The fact that the feedback is sitting at around 60% in favour across the city and in each local board for the minimum or more than the minimum, and the fact 20 councillors out of 21 voted for these 1200, 800s as they are, would we say we'd have the evidence to change them? And especially as you've just said, John, that the evidence you've got to take to the independent panel is that these are the medians, like the middle. I'm just wondering how you would argue to reduce them.
John?
Yeah.
If you...
I mean, at this point, you know, we, our subject matter expert lead on this, are still pretty comfortable with 1200 as the guide for the city centre in this Auckland context. But we're happy to, spend a bit more time looking at the feedback, just look at that a bit more. I mean, it's probably more going to be in the use of the word around means take into account the topography, other factors, the fact that on the edges of the city centre there isn't as much activity as there is in the core of the city centre. So maybe the 1200, should be pulled in a bit on certain edges of the city centre. So it's probably more in the nature of using that flexibility of approximately around 1200 metres. You'd previously resolved. So what you're also confirming is that all of those factors like topography, severance from major roads and so on are all relevant factors to take into account as to whether it should be 1200, more than 1200 or less than 1200. So there's quite a lot of flex in your resolutions already around the 1200. And again, mapping workshop on 6th of July should hopefully assist the committee to see where it's all heading. And then obviously 4th of August is your chance to determine finally whether the 1200 was the right distance or not.
Okay, and my next question, thank you, Chair, is I've asked a number of times around part of the plan change being adding more mixed use, especially in the walkable catchments. I'm still not seeing how we're incorporating mixed use, and if we are genuinely encouraging walking, then surely we should be having more mixed use in those areas. Otherwise, people are just going to drive to the next mall, etc. Have we been able to incorporate that?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hills, and very similar to the Deputy Mayor's question. Yes, there are definitely places where in these walkable catchments, the current residential zoning should change to mixed use with more flexibility for office and retail, but we haven't got the evidence to show where that should be happening, and a blanket approach of just taking all of the terrace and apartment zoning and walkable catchments and making it all mixed use, we certainly don't have the evidence, and that certainly would create some adverse effects in many places. So yes, it's really a future piece of work that we just haven't had the time or the resources to achieve anything on that front, unfortunately.
Okay, so it cannot, no extra mixed use can be incorporated, or you're going to try. I'm just wondering how this folds out from a development point of view.
It would be a future program of work when resources permit, weighed up against the other pieces of work the planning committee has asked the planning department to do, really. So we'll have to come back to you at a certain point and say, well, you know, this is where a piece of work around mixed use might sit. I'm not sure, and Karina might be able to clarify, but I don't believe that we can actually do that sort of rezoning through the intensification planning instrument to go from residential terrace and apartment to mixed use. It's not really, I don't believe, within scope of the intensification planning instrument. So it will be a parallel plan change with all of the work required around that. So I think the intent of what you're saying is absolutely right. We've had some feedback on this. Many of our team know that there are some places that really are at the point where they should go from residential to mixed use, but it's just a piece of work we're not able to do by August, and it would have to be a future bit of work for the new incoming council to prioritise.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now go to Councillor Kern, please.
Thanks, Chair. Kia ora, John. Firstly, just in terms of the feedback, I just wanted it to be clarified that in the report at paragraph 20, it says the sentiments of the residents associations was echoed in the general. They echoed the general feedback, but actually that's not the case at all. They had the quite the opposite response. I think it was about 68% of, particularly say looking at St Mary's Bay, didn't agree with the 1,200 metres. Can that just be clarified in terms of how the feedback was analysed?
Yeah, apologies, Councillor Coombe, if that's incorrect. Haven't had the time to follow up with the team to check that, but hopefully if our subject matter expert Ryan Bradley is online, he can check that and maybe come back to you on that. But I think you're probably right. You've probably done the work and looked at the feedback, and that may be an error that the sentiment of the resident associations was not as strong as the other respondents on that topic of city centre walkable catchment.
Yeah, I think it's just the drafting of the sentence.
Okay, yeah.
Has miscaptured it, so I just wanted to make that clear that it's not accurate. But Mr. Chair, I did have just a question around what the Ministry for the Environment's advice includes, because I think it was left hanging that it does provide advice that 800 metres is recommended for the walkable catchment from the city centre, but that's not actually the case. And I know that that's been circulated very widely and we've got a lot of correspondence about it. But can you please clarify, John, what the recommendation is from the Ministry for the Environment?
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. So the guidance is that 800 metres would be the minimum walkable catchment distance around rapid transit, and then there are statements in the guidance that other locations may have different walkable catchments. So the 800 is specified as the minimum for rapid transit stations, but it does go on to signal that there will be different. So different can only be more than 800 if 800 is the minimum. But it is just guidance, and some of the research we did, arguably goes beyond what the ministry officials were able to do in preparing that guidance. Can't say that for a fact, but I do know that we did extensive work on walkable catchments back in 2020 when we had a workshop with you. But hopefully that's clarified.
And it would be useful.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And it would be useful to get you said there is a reference that we can refer to that went on a public agenda. I haven't been able to find it. So if that is available, because it's not on I think it was the July meeting that we looked at it last year. But if there is possible to circulate the reference to the evidence, that would be really useful that we can share. So I don't need a response on that now. And just finally, Mr. Chair, just I think this is following on from Councillor Simpson's partai, and just confirming that the Chair's recommendation now, I think, does provide the ability for us, when you're bringing back the maps to us, John, that it will give us the ability to look at where the walkable catchment extends to in specific areas based on the feedback. So if you can just confirm that, that would be really useful.
So just to clarify, Councillor Scoon, that at the workshop we would give you more information on how that feedback's being addressed? Is that the question?
No, I guess I'm just wanting to really clarify the meaning of the new B2 and B3, that it's going to really give us an opportunity to go through the feedback, go through the analysis, and it will potentially look at where the extent of the walkable catchment lands. Like, we'll be literally looking at maps and being able to say, well, because of this feedback, it should change on these streets, around these areas. It might potentially extend in one point, but be decreased in another. And that's literally the exercise that we're going to undertake in July, looking at the maps, if we pass this direction today.
That's absolutely correct, 100%. Yep. Looking at maps and linking the changes to preliminary response, feedback, and the new maps that we're putting forward.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. That's my questions.
Yeah, that's a little reassuring to hear, because I guess the first point to note is that when that council meeting in July 2021 passed that resolution on the walkable catchments, it was, of course, without the benefit of the people who actually live in the area, which is a rather important fact. If anyone knows what the walkability it is, it's those residents rather than someone, almost deciding on an arbitrary figure. So in respect of that, and it follows on from some of the other questioners, I'm looking at the submissions of the Western Bays Community Group, a large percentage of which is Ponsonby, St Mary's Bay Association, Grey Lynn Residents Association, and there'll be others who all raise concerns about the walkability of that 1,200 figure. So what you've just said there, John, is that through this resolution, and notwithstanding the word confirm, which is an unfortunate choice really, because confirm really means to make something certain or establish the truth of something, if we look at the dictionary definition of it. But leave that aside, given the addition of subject to. There's going to be an ability in that time for each one of these little catchments then to be modelled or studied in more detail, and these views taken on board that go to topography and go to the difference between the inward journey and the outward journey, and that degree of complexity that is necessary to really get an appreciation of whether 1,200 is appropriate or not. Are we going to have the time and the resources to do that?
John.
Through the chair, I mean, the challenge with this entire process is the time frame. It's not even so much the resourcing. It's, as I said before, it's only 6 months since we've had the medium density standards come in, and that fundamentally changed and increased the workload exponentially. So we're down to the last 4 or 5 weeks. So you have a 4-hour workshop where we had 8,000 bits of feedback. We are doing our best to identify the really significant themes of where the walkable catchments, we may have got it wrong. But the feedback, there was a statistical exercise of the level of support, and that's all quite clear, and we understand that really well. But the level of individuals and associations and so on for all the different town centres who've gone on to the next level in their feedback and given us a whole lot of detail, we're doing our best, and 6th of July will be a point where we'll be able to present where we've got to with that feedback. And a lot of it is around local circumstances, but there is only so much can be achieved by August, unfortunately. So it's best endeavours on all parts, including elected members, to get through that exercise and see where we land 6th July and then in August.
Yeah. So yeah, I understand the constraint everyone's working on. That's one of the problems. Perhaps we should be kicking up a bit more of a fuss about that. As far as
I assure you we have.
Yeah. It hasn't done us very much good though, has it? That's a problem. In terms of those submissions that came in, John, and I'm just trying to mesh it up with what you said about the outside of the city centre, the extremities. A number of the associations made the point that to actually get to the amenities that they want to go to, it's actually 30, 40-minute walk. So what you've said in your initial comments is that that's irrelevant then. It's that outside, even though if they want to go to Britomart or the movies or whatever, it's actually 40 minutes to get into the amenities they might use. That's it. That's an irrelevancy, are you saying, under this criteria?
Well, it's a tricky thing because the term walkable catchment was very much picked up by the government and put into secondary legislation for the first time, as far as I'm aware. And the way it's drafted in the NPSUD, it's very much from the edge of this place, and you have to define a walkable catchment. And walkable catchments, all the literature and studies are about, the distance you walk from a certain point to another point. So, yeah, it is in the definition. It's the way it's been drafted. It doesn't allow for that sort of pulling it right in and saying, well, no, because our city centre doesn't have much on the edge of it, we're going to just have a very short one. But I mean, there is some flexibility in there, and I think we can take those sort of factors into account. And if it's it's more of I guess an art than a precise science defining walkable catchments. I'm not sure how much more I can add to that, really.
So for the associations such as St Mary's Bay, it does have other implications, doesn't it, in terms of whether they are, meet that 66% mark or that 75% if it's a walkable catchment. So for them in particular, there's a little bit more at stake here than other parts of Auckland in terms of the whole special character issue.
John.
Well, if we think about some of the rapid transit stations, though, they do have character areas, quite substantial character areas around some of the rapid transit stations as well. So in that regard, St Mary's Bay isn't unique. Mount Eden, Kingsland and so on are also on the rapid transit station. So it would be a similar issue in terms of how you define the walkable catchment. And but, St Mary's Bay is, there is a bit of distance between city centre and before you arrive at St Mary's Bay. So, I suppose there is a bit of a point of difference there, but it's not 100% unique. But I hear what you're saying. Maybe just one final thing on St Mary's Bay is it's also, if you think about it, Ponsonby Town Centre and the Three Lamps End is, a policy 3D says that we should be enabling intensification around town centres. Doesn't have such a bearing on the recommended approach in terms of the special character difference between in and out of a walkable catchment, but just to note that there are some policy 3D intensification expectations, I guess is one way of putting it, around town centres, and the Ponsonby Town Centre is immediately adjacent to St Mary's Bay.
So finally, Mr Chair, I guess the point I was trying to make is that in respect of St Mary's Bay and other areas that you mentioned, their special character protection is really at stake in terms of what distance is landed on through this walkability, and therefore that adds extra importance to this whole process. And what I'm hearing, and as we've heard all along, is that we're under huge time constraints to do this properly. So that's not a good position to be in, and it's not one where you really want to be confirming catchments on the basis that work may or may not be done through no fault of the officers.
Thank you. I think we need to leave that there as a comment. Yeah, I think that was your expectation. Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Mine's just a kind of a basic question. So what would be the effect of having a reduction in the walkable catchment when we're trying to make our city centre more vibrant and economically viable?
John.
Well, if you reduce the walkable catchment, you're enabling less housing around the city centre. And I guess that housing, would contribute to the vibrancy of the city centre. So, but as the previous presentation from Elizabeth Laird, you can see there is a huge amount of capacity potential for apartment residential in the city centre zone itself. But there would be a reduced number of people able to live immediately around the city centre. Having said that, there is already quite a bit of capacity in the unitary plan.
Yeah.
But it would be less than if you had a 1,200 metre walkable catchment.
And just quickly, so in terms of we talk about walkable catchments, but I guess, does it still account for a scooter or a bicycle so close to the city, right? So you've got the same sort of corridors for people who can walk. So it's not as if we're making people walk. The walkable catchment doesn't mean you have to walk. You can use other active kind of modes. Is that right?
John.
Yeah, Councillor Cooper, that's absolutely the case. It's just this whole idea of walkable catchments is based on walking as opposed to cycling or scootering. But within the sort of 10-minute walk, well, that's a much quicker scooter ride or a cycle ride than a walk.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sayers, your question.
Through you, Chair. Thank you very much. I guess the legislation is actually saying if we can create more housing, increase supply against the demand, then the housing will become more affordable, right? That's the premise of it. But my question would be around actual numbers. In terms of the unitary plan, my understanding is we have 560,000 homes. We're going to 900,000, over 340,000 homes. Extra, what's being proposed through the government's legislation with regard to Auckland? Do you know how many extra homes are expecting to be produced under this legislation in our catchment, i.e. Auckland?
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. I think the key point here is that planning rule books, the Auckland Unitary Plan does not deliver houses. Planning rules enable houses to happen, but there are so many other factors in the housing market, construction industry, labour, economics, land economics, borrowing, building materials and so on, that are such a provision of infrastructure to support the housing to enable it to go ahead. So the Auckland Unitary Plan does not deliver houses. It enables housing to be delivered, and as you pointed out, it already, and it's in a published report with a lot of analysis into it, that there is over 900,000 dwellings can be built just in the residential zones of Auckland. So that would easily cater for the population growth of Auckland into the next sort of medium to long term horizon. The application of NPSUD and medium density residential standards is certainly going to increase that quite significantly. We're not at the point of being able to give you a figure quite yet, and there's still some moving parts, as we know. But I think the question around what was the expectation in terms of how many extra houses would be delivered in Auckland. I know the government, as part of the housing amendment bill did have PricewaterhouseCoopers produce a report, and I think there was some figure there around an extra 45,000 houses would be delivered. But I guess one of the key issues we take with that again is that the unitary plan does not deliver houses, and so with the significant capacity already there, it was very difficult to see how increasing the capacity would be directly delivering more homes, and so we did question a number of assumptions in that PwC report around the extra houses that would be delivered. I think that was the phrase in Auckland.
Yeah, thanks, John. In the public announcement the government made, they were hoping to achieve about 50 to 140,000 houses nationwide. So that was the purpose of my question to you about what would Auckland's share be of that. But thank you for your answer around that. The next thing is around affordability, which I brought up in the confidential workshop. So, which I said I'd mention in the public arena, because the drivers are increasing capacity or supply of housing, and the expectation, the result of that is that housing will be more affordable. Now, my observation is in areas of Auckland where that has happened, houses are no more affordable. They're probably over $1.2 million. So are you or anybody in the team here, Mr. Chair, able to give me an answer around what is the government's definition of affordability? Because it's all driven around affordability, so what is it? What's the target? Where are we going to? Can anyone answer that, please?
John, can you respond to that? I mean,
thanks, Councillor Sayers. It's probably not correct to say that the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the changes to the Resource Management Act were exclusively about housing affordability. They're also about providing a greater choice of housing types, and certainly they were proposed as trying to achieve a more compact, intensive urban form. In our submission to the Select Committee on the bill, we certainly had some question marks around whether that was, in fact, the case. The first point really is that I don't believe the government has put forward the NPSUD or the Resource Management Amendment Act purely on the basis of dealing with housing affordability, but it certainly is a key factor in the government's proposals. But in terms of a specific impact that the government has suggested, I'm not aware of what they're suggesting it might do for house prices. What I do know is that in 2016, when the unitary plan became operative in part, we saw a sort of plateau and a slight dip in house prices, that our chief economist at the time had evidence to say there was a link between the unitary plan provisions kicking in for the first time and house prices. But after 6 months, with all the other factors at play, house prices took off again and have continued to take off, and now there's plateau. So yes, there's a little bit of a link between planning rules being relaxed in 2016 and house prices, but it has just taken off again. So there's not a direct correlation in the long term.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate your answer, and it's probably the professional answer I expected from you, and I deeply respect you and your team. Mr. Chair, I will only comment if there's an amendment put up, but my comment at the moment would be this is nothing but showboating.
Okay, we're not in comments. We're in questions. So if you can reserve that until we come back to the comments, that's great. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to clarify that particular point as well. So, sorry if I can. I've been asked to go, please. Sorry, Councillor. Sorry. So we're doing comments and questions per thing. So, because I'd like a comment on this as well as a question, but
no, we're not in comments.
I'm just checking.
Once we go through the questions on each section, then we can be open to comment.
Okay, cool. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. Cool. Just one question from me. If the reason for a conservative approach as we've been advised, is that we don't have the services. Why was it seen as not a priority to look at more mixed use and actually look at and remove lack of services as the problem, right? Why didn't we prioritise this work?
Through Chair, short answer is we have prioritised the statutory requirement to deliver the NPSUD and the MDRS by August. We've diverted almost all of our resources towards this. And so it has been, the mandatory things have been prioritised. Yep, that's the short answer. And there's no additional resource or time to do anything more than that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hills, please.
Apologies, Chair, I didn't mean to ask a second round, but I'm not sure if this comes later or now. But just on the fact we are looking to leave the light rail corridor out of this till later, I hadn't actually
No, you'll have to put
realised.
both earpieces in because we can't hear you again.
Gosh, I'm so sorry. The leaving the light rail corridor out of this at this time, yes, I understand it from a resource perspective on specifically the light rail corridor because we don't know the exact route. But my concern is that it means a very big delay in the legal, I guess, upzoning of the areas around the current train stations of the heavy rail. Could that please be explained why we would do that and how we can incorporate it all and then add the layer later? I think
that's under P. We're just a little bit ahead of ourselves there. I think that is under the P. We're going to have to canvass that there. So if you look at the recommendation under other matters, I think we need to canvass that there because the Auckland Light Rail route currently does not have a walkable catchment.
But I guess what I'm saying is it affects the other walkable catchments if light rail didn't exist. It's going to preclude upzoning in those walkable catchments.
I prefer we handled it at the P, please. Can we come back, please?
Thank you.
Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my questions are to John, and in asking him these questions, I very much realise from earlier reports and this report just the amount of pressure that they've been under and the fact that the resources required to respond to this appropriately have been extraordinarily difficult. So what I am struggling with is just how words are going to be interpreted in a legal sense in terms of direction that we're giving to officers today. John, you've said that it's probably more an art than a science, and talking about the moving parts, I've been mindful of the complexity of this and just how it's confusing enough for elected members, let alone the public. So the first question is, what weighting are officers giving to consultation? Because I feel that there are a lot of people who really don't understand what is at stake here.
John?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I guess as experts in planning or urban design or heritage, we have to give you a professional opinion, and that may at times differ from the sort of public sentiment, and I guess we have to give you that free and frank professional advice so that whatever you put out in August for submissions is going to be as robust as possible and withstand submissions and through the hearings process. But obviously as the committee, as elected members, you can head in a very different direction or a slightly different direction and see where that gets to through the hearings. But we'll always give you our professional advice. But look, when it comes to the consultation process and the feedback, it has been quite reassuring to see that there is more feedback in support of the walkable catchments than against it. Either way, people wanting more or less, there's more feedback to sort of keep it roughly where we're at with the 400, the 800 and the 1200. So in terms of walkable catchments, the feedback is quite reassuring that the public, the general view seems to be that that the council isn't too far off the mark with these 800 and 1200 metre distances. The same with the town and the local centres and the neighbourhood centres. We can't say the majority of the feedback supported the approach that you've endorsed previously and that we're seeking you reconfirm, subject to some refinements, but there was more feedback from memory in support of the approach to town and local centres and neighbourhood centres than opposed to it, wanting, less intensification or more. So, yeah, and that's how we're factoring it in, Councillor Fletcher, is that it's just reassuring to see that we're generally in the side of more of the positives than wanting to be more expansive or more or less expansive in terms of intensification.
Thank you for that. I want to get to the concern that I've got with the use of some of the language, but it's, and I don't want to delve into what I understand is the capacity within the unitary plan, and I certainly don't want to get into a debate around the housing enabling and whether or not that does or doesn't deal with land costs and whether it's going to deal with affordability. But what I want to understand is what the impact on all of this will be on older Aucklanders and people with disabilities. So my discomfort is, along with Councillor Watson, the use of the word confirm. And I heard what Megan Tyler said in terms of subject to, but I want to know whether there had been any further thought about, at this stage, subject to further evidence or information coming through, and particularly under the chair's recommendation under B3, more work and suitability. Those words are ambiguous to me. What does more work mean? Is that a directive? Is that how should I interpret that?
John.
Well, it is a chair's recommendation, but I'll have a go at interpreting it from my point of view. As I've said before, we've got the generally sticking to the 800 metres and the 1200, but in some places it's already in the preliminary response a bit further than that or a bit less. When we look at the feedback, there'll be refinements around the edges that we'll bring in the maps, and Roman numeral 2, recognise that. Your original resolutions already recognised factors like topography and that the 800 and the 1200 are really a guide rather than an absolute. But when it comes to Roman numeral 3 around the city centre, the more work being done to determine the suitability, I guess that's more work around looking at that issue of other studies that maybe go into, well, at a city centre edge, there isn't as much activity in Auckland as other places. We can see what we can do in the time frame, but I probably can't add a huge amount more.
But is that suitability for people with disabilities, or is it suitability for people that are